Good morning, everybody. Glad you could all come this morning to another meeting of the Coronado Roundtable. I'm Christian Esquevin. I'm the current year president. So thank you all for coming. We'd like to thank Lyman Green for preparing coffee this morning. Thank you, Lyman. And now that we're all comfortably seated, I'd like to ask you to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, liberty and justice for all. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that we lost one of our board member emeritus, Miles Harvey. I don't know if those of you who knew Miles, he was quite an individual and a strong supporter of the Roundtable. So our loss and the community's loss of Miles Harvey. As you may know, our programs are recorded for Zoom, and we thank Nicholas Burmeister from the library staff for that service and the library. Those of you who may be at home, if you'd mute your computer or device and turn off your camera. You can use, if you're at home, the chat box for the question and answer period that will follow. I think all of you should be able to hear at the back of the room, but let us know if you can't. Our next program next month, October 27th, will feature retired Admiral Terry Craft speaking about the USS Midway. So that should be a fascinating program. But today I'm your speaker. We'll be talking about genealogy, DNA, and ancestral voyages. So the topic of genealogy is something that I've been involved in personally for over 40 years. I'll be talking about DNA because that becomes part of a lot of genealogy these days. I am not a geneticist or a biologist, but I do have a bachelor's degree in anthropology, for which I had to also study archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology, tribal life, all of those that intersect some of the things that get into the ancestral voyages part of this and some of the other intersections of what I'll be talking about. I started doing a genealogy back in the old days when I had to request old microfilm from the Family History Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. And those were copies of handwritten records coming from there that had those records of baptisms and marriages and so forth in France. So, and it would take quite a while just for those to arrive. So it was a laborious process, certainly nothing like today where a lot of that is digitized and you can get it sitting at home on your computer or coming here to the library, since they have Ancestry.com as a service you can get for free. But let me go on to this PowerPoint slideshow as we can get into some of the resources. This is just a paper copy of something that's on the web, but is a fairly simple way of recording your own genealogy. You can buy these from that Misbach company that's at the lower bottom left there. And it says it's a 6th generation pedigree chart. It's actually 5 generation. And it's a simple way to record several generations starting. It actually starts with, if you're married and you have children, the first generation are really your children. And you can put your own name there, and then your parents with birthplace, death place, if that's relevant, and then so forth onto your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. There's not a lot of room on this kind of form, so it's fairly rudimentary, but that's one place to start. The digital way to do this, if you subscribe to something like Ancestry or MyHeritage, is a lot more sophisticated, and you can really get into a lot more detail, including biographical information about all of your ancestors. So that's a much better way to go. And you can do a certain amount of ancestors for free before you really have to pay for the service. The common sources of genealogical information and family history are things that you start off with if you're just beginning. Oral history, if you can interview family members, that's a good way to begin and to get the oral history or to get documents if you don't have those already. Family records, starting with your parents, birth records, your grandparents possibly, and the complete names of parents, their birthplaces. Those are really the building blocks of genealogy. The correct names, not just, sometimes the correct names are a little bit different. Your parent may have preferred a middle name, but it's not what's in their birth records. Photographs are great sources of genealogical information. Those may include siblings, cousins. They may include information on the back that is very valuable, including such things as were they a store owner, possibly your grandparents. That could be listed on the back, and they can have again grandparents information, etc. Newspapers are a fascinating source of information, especially small town newspapers that had wedding information, obituaries, for example, businesses that your ancestors may have owned, and even large municipal newspapers had all sorts of information. In cities where there were military bases that had the comings and goings of military personnel, including promotions and so forth. Local libraries often have those digitized, and historical societies do also. And historical societies often have, either at the small town level or the county level, often have family histories that have been written and published. So family histories may have your family history, or those of ancestors, or cousins, etc. That's a great source. Census records every 10 years. Those are easily accessible these days on the web and through those sources such as Ancestry or MyHeritage. Miscellaneous sources of information such as school yearbooks. There's a collection here of the local schools. Phone directories for finding addresses and information about where your family may have lived. Cemetery headstones. There are sources that list where a family name headstone may be located. Ship passenger lists. That's a source that's in Ancestry and MyHeritage, etc. This source of information, all digital, is a handout on the back table if you want to take it as you leave. But the National Archives, again, the source for census and military records. There's the link, Ancestry.com. That's available here in the library, but you have to use it here in the library. You can also subscribe to it. And it's a great source of information, not just of those databases that I mentioned, but they have all kinds of supplemental information from all types of records. So, and you get noticed, you get pinged for any time something comes up. And you can actually build your own family tree on Ancestry. The same with MyHeritage below. You can have your DNA tested. Find My Past, that's something for strictly North American records, or as they trace back to Great Britain. The Smithsonian Libraries, that's a source for genealogical research. Online county histories, biographies and indexes. That's a genealogical guide. The Family Tree magazine has a lot of useful articles, and including how you can print out your family tree in a huge printout that's table length or more. Now, as I get into DNA a little bit, this is kind of a schematic of what the double helix looks like that was first discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick. And DNA is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, the building block of how we came to be who we are. It's the DNA that's inside of our molecules that is really the building block of the functioning of an organism. And it ends up controlling the chromosomes and the genes that code everything that we come to be, including our eye color, the color of our skins and hair, our height, etc. And gene is just a shortened term that was coined for genetic. And DNA is located in the cell nucleus. And there's also genetic material outside of the nucleus, and that is called mtDNA, which is short for mitochondrial DNA. And that's actually passed down from mother to her children. We'll get into that a little bit later, but every person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. The 22 are paired as either XX or XY. And then the last pair are either XX or XY, and those are the sex determining chromosomes. So, and they determine the sex of the child. Females have two X's, and the male has an X and a Y. So that will determine the sex of the offspring. And it becomes important in future inheritance that the XY is passed down from the male. DNA is recombined in every generation. So this is a kind of a schematic of how it's passed down in 3 generations. And there are advantages of why it's recombined. Otherwise, everybody would look like everybody else. And there are advantages for natural selection and the variety of range of traits. So this is a simplified schematic. The grandparents there, the father, the mother, well, the grandparents actually, and then the father and the mother, and then the children. You can see that the children all have very different traits from each other, unless they're identical twins. They're very different from each other. So those of you that are parents know that. So even though they're all from the same parents, they can look very different, sometimes not look like, you know, their brother and sister or sister and sister, etc. So that's what happens because of DNA is recombined in this kind of pattern. This is what happens after several generations of sharing DNA. The very bottom here, excuse me, let me go back. The very bottom here, say, is you and your parents. You have 50% from each parent, and you have 25% of DNA from mitochondrial DNA from each parent, and so forth, 12% and 6%, and then 3%, and then 1% by the time you get to the top layer there, by which time you have 126 ancestors. So based on doing your DNA test with one of the services, you can't tell too much about your ancestors from many generations ago based on a AT-DNA ethnicity test. So I'm going to get into what kind of test you will probably want to take or need to do a different type of analysis to really tell what you need to do instead of just a ethnicity analysis of your DNA test. So that's a autosomal DNA analysis. So there are two types of genealogical trees or family trees. The genealogical family tree, where you can go back with the family records, those you know about, based on records. You can go back hundreds or even 1,000 years. But your DNA family tree, you can't tell too much because people fall off because of those previous charts. They fall off because DNA is not evenly inherited. Another phenomenon that happens is what's called pedigree collapse. The somewhat logical thing you would expect is you have two parents and they have two parents each, and then, your grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. And if you go back through all of your ancestors, there should be a geometric increase through all of the generations. And if you go back through that geometric or exponential increase, if you went back to the Middle Ages, it would be calculated that you have 1 billion ancestors by the Middle Ages. Well, that's impossible because there weren't 1 billion people living back then. So what happens in actuality is every family has what's called a pedigree collapse. You'll find if you do go back to the 1600s or the 1500s, or sometimes even back 4 generations, is you'll find that you've got ancestors that appear in several lines of your genealogical family tree. This is just one way of showing it, where you've got an ancestor that appears in more than one spot. That happens a lot where you've got a lot of people living in one geographic location, like in Appalachia, or they may have a religious commonality, like in the Mennonites, or that they were geographically together in one area because of migration patterns, maybe the Cajuns, or for a variety of reasons, you have ancestors that appear. So you've got a great-great-grandfather in one line on your father's side that was also appearing on your mother's side. So that's called pedigree collapse, because it ends up being a chart that looks like an ancestral tree that looks like this. They also end up sharing DNA. That's not a big deal. Happens a lot in aristocratic families. It's not necessarily bad unless it's, maybe a case where it's fairly recent, and then there may be a gene for a particular malady that increases the chances of that occurring in one particular family. That can happen. Y-DNA is the male line DNA, can be tested specifically if you request it from an ancestral DNA service like Ancestry or MyHeritage. Is different than the mitochondrial DNA. That's one way to get more specific in terms of long ago ancestors. And you can have somebody else on the male line to get that even more specified. Mitochondrial DNA, that's found, again, outside the cell nucleus, and that's passed down from mother to all of her children. And that tests female descendants in a haplogroup, just like Y-DNA is tested for male line haplogroups. Haplogroups can get into long ago ancestors and their specific migratory patterns. Let me get into that. A haplogroup, and that's kind of the definition there, that's a genetic cluster or of a population group who share common ancestors on the patrilineal or matrilineal line. Main groupings of haplogroups are assigned letters of the alphabet and then numbers and letter combinations. You can find them out by the testing by the services. And they can really tell you where your genetic group country of origin is located. When I did a DNA testing of my own, and that's where you either give the service a saliva test or whatever, you'll get your analysis of where your people are supposed to come from. I did mine through MyHeritage, and this is the analysis that they gave me. I was supposed to be 33% Scandinavian, 26% Iberian, that means Spanish, 12% North and West European, close to 12% Sardinian. Sardinian is just below Corsica in the Mediterranean. 8% Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, and 6.6% East European, and almost 2% Italian. There isn't any French in there, and that's where all of my people come from. So what's going on with this chart? Well, I think that first test was done of an mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA type test, rather than a Y-DNA test of my father's line. even so, this is a ethnicity test, and they don't have a French ethnicity category. So looking at what happened when they, about a year or two later, when they gave me this kind of map analysis. Those large bubbles there correspond to what that previous chart said. The big bubble to the north is the Scandinavian. The big bubble to the right, this one here is the East European. That's the Iberian Spanish one. This is the Italian one. That's the English Welsh or Scottish one. I guess that's Sardinia there. This is the one they didn't give me, but the one that's the true one. And that's the one that really counts. That's and this one right here in particular is the one that came through in a genetic group chart. So that's northern France, Belgium, where my father's line actually comes from. And the rest of France there is where my mother's line comes from. So this kind of information you get from a genetic group, Y-DNA test. So you have to look beyond what they may be telling you in a ethnic analysis to what they should be telling you in a genetic test of your DNA. This is just a kind of a side note, but this is a illuminated manuscript of the genealogy of the kings of Wessex. Nothing to do with DNA, but this is something I found out through the old-fashioned way of looking through records. And here it has Æthelwulf at the very top there, that big symbol there. That's Æthelwulf, King of Wessex. Before England became England, Great Britain was divided up in a whole bunch of different kingdoms, and Æthelwulf was just the King of Wessex. And he had several sons. Then the last one here, Alfred the Great, tried to unify England into England. He was partially successful, but his grandson finally was successful. But anyway, Alfred the Great was my 34th great grandfather. So when you do genealogy and you're lucky enough to plug into one aristocratic family, you can usually get drafted up into other aristocratic families, and you can usually find somebody who's noble, and you can go pretty far back. And this may happen to you. So, and it becomes more colorful. So keep at it. Other colorful things that happen when you look at haplogroups in history is that you find out what really happened in ancient world history. You know, okay, you look at where America came from, where the settlers to America came from, and you think, well, they came from, they came from the United Kingdom, or maybe they came from Scandinavia, or maybe they came from Italy or Ireland. Okay, well, where did they come before that? Maybe they came from Latin America more recently. Where did they come before that? And where did they come before that? And before that? And before that? This chart shows where virtually where our ancestors came from. Actually, they came from Africa. They came from Africa, and they went north and they went east. But that's really going back into anthropological times. But modern man relatively came from here with the Yamnaya people, where a lot of agriculture and animal husbandry started back in 5000 BC. Why did it start here? And these people went east, and they went west, and they went south. This, nowadays this would be considered the Russian steppes, but this was long before there was any Russia or any Ukraine, etc. But these people, the Yamnaya, domesticated the horse and cattle. Once they domesticated the horse, they actually milked horses for milk and to make cheese. And they developed carts, rolling stock, and chariots. Once they had those, they could do a lot. Chariots were useful in warfare. The animal husbandry meant that they weren't just dependent on finding their food by basic hunting and gathering. They had a steady food supply from their livestock. They could hunt on their horses. They could use their chariots to kill their neighbors. They could, there was a lot of, I'm not going to get into the polemic of climate change, but there was a lot of climate change back then. So, as weather weather patterns changed, there was always a reason to migrate. So the migratory patterns, obviously, they can expand because of their better technology in all of these different directions at different periods. East, and then by those different years, they're in different parts. And those two seas there, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea here, and that's Turkey down below, and then getting into Europe here. So how do we know all this? Well, there haplogroup is shared by all of the Western Europeans now. The R1b haplogroup that's in red are shared by those ancient Yamnaya people, and the red pie chart there. In Spain, France, the UK, Switzerland, a good part of Germany, and other places you see there. A little bit less so in the Scandinavian countries. That's kind of split between some Yamnaya, some of the Germanic, which is in the light green, and so forth. So that's what makes DNA interesting, not just from a personal point of view of, you know, where your people come from when you analyze it, but where your people, you know, your ancient people come from. And it shows where migration from ancient times came from. And that's, you know, that's from, say, 3000 BC onwards. But migration, besides that, was a continual thing that happened, because in between that period, there was migration as a continual process, because the migratory patterns tended always to go west. And then it stopped there because there was the ocean. And the western parts of those lands were always more productive agriculturally and less prone to bad weather than the eastern parts of that European landmass. So you have everybody from the Huns to the Mongols pushing west, and then the Germanic tribes, and then the Norse Vikings, everybody pushing west and south all along the way, and all of them leaving their DNA throughout the UK, France, Italy, and Spain. And that's not to mention the civilizations, like the Roman civilization that also added to the mix of DNA for the people that eventually crossed the seas and came to America. So we're all the result of a variety of people that kept migrating, and usually forcefully taking over somebody else's property. I won't get into slavery, white slavery that was happening all along that whole migratory situation, but that has happened over all of those thousands of years also. So that's my talk. I'll get into one more slide here, and that's one of the printed genealogies there. This one goes not many generations back in time, but it covers a lot of the different recent generations there that you can have done with your family too. So that's one that's possible to print out. So we can take a short break and then have questions and answers if you want to get coffee. Thank you. Thank you.